Honoria Fenwick was handed the coats. 40 guests swept into Fenmoor Hall, and the spinster cousin stood at the foot of the great stair with her arms full of other people's wool. She did not flush. She only folded them, one over the other, neat as a shopgirl folding cloth. This was Yorkshire, in the winter of 1873. Then, the Duke of Fenmoor threw a dead man's letter down on the green card table. "Break this cipher," he said, "and £3,000 is yours. There is not a man in 3 shires who can read it, and certainly no woman who could even begin." The room laughed. No one offered her a look at it. They read the letter aloud. Only Honoria went still. She murmured one word to herself, running key, and slid a small brass disc from her pocket, unseen. "If you believe respect is earned in silence, this story is for you." Before we go on, do one small thing for me. Subscribe so the ending finds you, and comment the town you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels tonight. Now, let me take you back to the beginning. Honoria Fenwick came to Fenmoor Hall the winter the old Duke vanished. She came with one trunk and a writing box, and no one at the hall could quite say what she was for. She was a cousin of the late Duchess' poor side of the family. She was 38, unmarried, and plainly dressed in grey. The household decided she was the dowager's companion, and so a companion she became. It was unpaid. She was fed and housed, and that was called generous. She mended the dowager's lace. She read to her in the long afternoons. She wound the clocks that the footman forgot. And in the hours no one wanted from her, she read. She read in 4 languages that nobody at Fenmoor had ever asked her to read: French, German, Greek. A little Arabic she had taught herself from a borrowed grammar and never spoke aloud. On her desk sat a small brass disc, 2 rings of engraved letters, one turning inside the other. Her father had filed it by hand. He had been a naval officer, a signalsman, dead now these 12 years. He had shown her, when she was 9, how the letters could be shifted, and how a word could be hidden inside another word, and how a patient mind could find its way back out. It was the only thing he left her that she valued. The staff, when they saw it, called it the companion's toy. They did not know what she had been. Before, few people did. For 6 years, under a name that was not quite her name, Honoria Fenwick had corresponded with some of the finest puzzle minds in England. She signed her letters H. Fen, she let them think Fen was a man, because a man's questions were answered and a woman's were not. She had solved things. She had published solutions in the quiet journals where such things are read by the few who care. And one of her correspondents for years had been the old Duke of Fenmoor himself, Cornelius Vane. He had written to Fen about ciphers, about the way the ancients hid meaning, about a method he was fond of, where the key to a secret was not a short word, but a whole book. They had argued, on paper, like 2 friends who had never met and never would. And then, one grey morning 3 winters past, Cornelius Vane walked out of Fenmoor Hall and did not come back. He was declared dead in the end, and when he vanished, so did the letters, so did Fen's small standing in the world. Honoria became, once more, only the woman in grey who wound the clocks. Here is the thing the new Duke did not understand about the house he had inherited. Cornelius Vane had been rich, not in the way of land, which cannot be spent, but in the way of gold, which can. Somewhere in his last strange years, he had gathered up the family's ready money, £38,000, gold and bonds together. He had taken it out of the banks where a nervous man could watch it dwindle, and he had hidden it. On the grounds, it was said, though no one knew where. And he had left, as the only key to it, a single letter written in a cipher no living soul could read. The new Duke needed that money badly. His name was Aldous Vane, and he was 46, and he had inherited the title, the debts, and the mystery all in 1 week. He owed £12,000 to a banking house called Cawood and Thrale. The mortgage fell due at Michaelmas. 31 days off when this story truly begins. If he could not pay it, Harrowmere itself would go under the hammer, and he would be a duke of nothing. So he had done what proud men do when they are frightened. He had thrown a party. And he had summoned clever men to break the letter for him, and made a sport of it, so no one would see the fear under the pride. The first of those clever men arrived on the second evening. His name was Professor Edmund Callow of the Royal Society, and he was the most celebrated cryptographer in England. He had a great domed head and a voice made for lecture halls. At dinner he held the whole table, telling of codes he had broken for the Admiralty, of secrets he had pulled from the air. The Duke beamed. Here, at least, was a man who would earn his fee. Honoria sat below the salt. That is an old phrase, and it means exactly what it says. The great silver salt cellar sat in the middle of the long table, and the important people sat above it, near the Duke, and the unimportant people sat below it, near the door. Honoria sat below. She was given the neck of the fowl and the end of the conversation, and she took both without complaint. Callow, warming to his own performance, quoted a line of Greek. He was speaking of an old inscription, and he wished to seem learned, and he rendered the Greek with a flourish. But he rendered it wrong. He had mistaken one word for another that looked like it, and in doing so he had turned a line about a guarded gate into a line about a guarded goat. It was a small thing. Nobody at the table knew enough Greek to catch it. Honoria caught it. She did not mean to speak, but the error sat there so plainly that the correction was out of her mouth before she had weighed the cost of it. "Forgive me," she said quietly. "I think that is pile, the gate, not ea, the goat. The stone guards a gate." For a moment the table went still. Callow looked down the length of it, past the salt, to the grey woman by the door, as if a chair had spoken. Then the Duke laughed. "My cousin reads a little of everything and understands none of it," he said. "Don't mind her, Professor. She keeps the dowager's books and mistakes it for scholarship." He waved a hand at the brass disc, which lay by her plate, where she had set it down. "See, she brings her toys to dinner." The table laughed with him, because that is what tables do. Callow gave a thin smile and returned to his story. Honoria lowered her eyes and turned the little disc over once, under her fingers, and said nothing more. But Callow, I will tell you, did not quite forget it. Somewhere in the back of that great domed head, a small door had opened. He had checked the Greek later, in his room, from the book in his bag. And she had been right. He said nothing of it. But he did not forget. The offences grew from there. They always do, in a house that has decided what you are. She was passed over at breakfast and spoken over at tea. When the ladies walked in the cold gardens, they walked ahead of her, and she was left to mind the shawls. When a footman needed a hand carried, it was her hand he asked. She was the sort of person a great house keeps and does not see, a convenience with a face. She bore it as she bore the weather, steadily, and without expecting it to change. Then, on the fourth morning, the post came. The post at Harrowmere came in a leather bag and was sorted on the hall table by the butler, who laid each letter face up so the direction could be read. Honoria was crossing the hall with the dowager's medicine when she saw it. One letter, near the top of the pile, addressed in a hand she knew, because it was a hand that wrote to her, and the direction on it read, H. Fen, Esq. Care of Harrowmere Hall. Esquire, a gentleman's word. It was from a journal in London, she guessed, or from one of the puzzle men who still believed Fen was a man of leisure somewhere in the north. Someone had learned that Fen's letters found their way to Harrowmere and had written to him there. She did not break stride. She set down the medicine, and she gathered the whole pile as if to carry it through to the breakfast room, which was a thing she often did. And in the carrying, that one letter went into her sleeve, and then into her pocket, quiet as a leaf falling. The butler saw a companion tidying the post. He did not see the direction. No one saw the direction, only Honoria, and only you. She carried the rest through and laid it by the Duke's plate, and she went about her day with a stranger's letter warm against her ribs, and a small hard knot of the old life beating there again after 3 cold years. It was that same afternoon that Thomas Ashby returned the journal. Ashby was the land agent of Harrowmere. He was 44, a widower, a square, quiet man who knew every drain and hedge and tenant on the estate and cared for all of them more than the family did. Some weeks before, he had borrowed from the Hall's library a bound volume of a cryptographic journal. He had borrowed it, in truth, for her. He had seen her reading such things in the window seat and had marked which numbers were missing, and had quietly got them for her from a bookseller in York, and had lent them under his own name so that no one would remark on a companion ordering scholarship through the post. He found her in the corridor and gave her the volume, wrapped in brown paper. "I've done with it," he said, though they both knew he had never once opened it. "Thought you might want it back on the shelf where it lives," and then, because he was a plain man and could not manage a compliment sideways, he said it straight. "You've a rare mind, Miss Fenwick. It's a waste what they make of you here. I hope you know that somebody sees it." It was the only kind word she would hear all that week. She held the wrapped journal and looked at this square, unhandsome, decent man, and for a moment her steadiness nearly failed her. "Thank you, Mr. Ashby," she said. That was all she trusted herself to say. He nodded and touched his hat and went back out to the cold and the tenants. He knew nothing of Fen, nothing of the fortune. He had prized her mind before he knew it was worth anything to anyone. Remember that. It matters, later. And then came the 5th night, the night of the wager. The loudest thing that happened at Harrowmere, and the worst. The dinner had run long, and the wine had run freely. The Duke was drunk, and under the drink he was frightened, because the day's post had brought a stiff line from Cawood and Thrale, reminding him that Michaelmas came, whether he willed it or no. Callow and 2 other summoned men had spent 4 days on the letter and got nowhere. The Duke could feel the house sliding out from under him, and a frightened, proud man will always, in the end, make a show. So he made one. He had the ciphered letter fetched from the study. It was carried in on a silver tray, this small brown page that held £38,000 inside its nonsense, and he laid it down himself on the green baize of the card table, where the light of 40 candles fell on it. The guests gathered round. Ladies in silk and men in black, 40 of them, warm and idle and pleased to be shown a mystery. "You've all heard the tale of my late uncle's little joke," the Duke said. "The old fool hid the family's money and left us this to find it by. Well, I'm tired of paying scholars to fail." He looked round the ring of faces, and he found his courage in their attention, and he raised his voice for the whole room. "So here is a sportsman's offer. Break this cipher, read me what it says, and £3,000 is yours. In gold, on the spot." He let that land. Then he smiled, and here came the line that he would live to regret. "There is not a man in 3 shires who can read it, and no woman who could even begin." The room laughed. It laughed the easy laugh of people who have never been the joke. Callow smiled his thin smile. The 2 other experts looked at the letter with the wounded pride of men who had already failed at it, and Honoria Fenwick, standing at the back where she belonged, felt the whole shape of the thing settle over her like a cold hand. She looked at the letter on the baize. Even from where she stood 10 feet off, she could see the run of it. The way the blocks fell, the way no single sign repeated the way a simple code would repeat. And something in the trained back of her mind, the part that had argued ciphers with a dead man for 6 years, said one quiet word. Running key. Not a simple substitution, where one letter always stands for another, and patience and counting will pull it apart. This was the harder thing. The thing Cornelius had loved, A cipher where the key is not a word, but a whole text, a book, a page, running letter by letter under the message, so that the same sign means a different thing each time it falls. Break a running key, and you must know which book, and no man in that room knew which book. But she knew Cornelius, and the knowing pulled her forward before she could stop her own feet. She stepped toward the table. The Duke saw her move, and in front of 40 guests, he lifted one lazy hand and waved her back like a dog from the fire. "No, no, cousin, not you." The laughter swelled again. "Fetch the port. There's a good creature. Leave the letters to the gentleman. Fetch the port." She stopped. She stood very still, the way she had stood at the foot of the stair with the coats in her arms. She did not flush. She did not answer. She let the moment close over her head like water. And under her breath, so low that not one soul in that bright room could hear it, she said the word again to herself. Running key. Her hand found the brass disc in her pocket, where it always was, and her thumb ran once around its edge, and she pocketed the certainty along with it. Then she turned, and she went, and she fetched the port. Because that is what they had decided she was for. But something had changed in her, in that going. You could not have seen it. It did not show on her plain grey face. But the woman who carried the port back into that room was no longer waiting for a door to be opened to her. She had, somewhere on that short walk to the sideboard and back, decided to open it herself. She just did not know it yet. The next morning the real work began, and the real comedy with it. For the Duke had bought himself a house full of experts, and now the experts had to earn their keep. They set up in the long gallery, at a wide table under the tall windows, with the ciphered letter copied out fair, so the precious original need not be handled. Professor Callow at the head, and the 2 other men flanking him, and pens and paper and reference books, stacked like a small siege. And for 4 days they laid that siege, and for 4 days the walls did not fall. Honoria watched them. She could not help it. She had reason to be in the gallery a dozen times a day, carrying, fetching, minding the dowager, who liked to sit in the window and doze in the thin sun. And each time she passed the table she saw a little more of what they were doing, and each time her heart sank a little further at how wrong they had it. They were counting. That is what you do to a simple cipher. You count how often each sign appears, because in plain English the letter E is common and the letter Z is rare, and the counts will betray the code. Callow had his frequency tables laid out in beautiful columns. But the counts came out flat. Every sign appeared about as often as every other, and the great man frowned at his own tables and could not see why, because a running key flattens the counts to nothing, and he had not let himself believe it was a running key. It was too hard. There would be no glory in it. So he chased the easy answer for 4 days and got flatness for his trouble. They guessed keywords next. That is the other thing you do. You suppose the old man used a secret word, and you try them. Haromere, Vane, Cornelius, the names of his dogs which the Duke supplied. They fed each guess into the letter and turned the crank of it and got out nonsense. Over and over, a fresh nonsense each time. The paper piled up. The 2 lesser men grew short with each other. Callow grew quiet, which in a proud man is the worst sign of all. And Honoria, passing with a tray, or a shawl, or a book for the dowager, read the cipher text over their shoulders in the 3 seconds it took to cross behind their chairs. She had it by heart within a day. And she knew, the way you know a face in a crowd, exactly what it was. She could have told them in 1 sentence. She could have saved them 4 days and a great deal of pride. She said nothing. Not because she was cruel, because the Duke had told her, in front of 40 people, to fetch the port, and a word from her now would only be waved away like a fly. She had learned that lesson at the foot of the stair a long time ago. So she carried her trays and held her tongue and watched the greatest cryptographer in England batter his head against a door she already had the shape of. On the fourth afternoon, Callow gave up. He did it quietly, which was the only dignified thing left to him. He set down his pen and pushed back the beautiful, useless tables and rubbed his great domed forehead with both hands. "It's no substitution," he said at last, to the room, to himself. "The counts are flat. Dead flat. There's no purchase anywhere." He shook his head slowly. "It's a running key. It must be. He's laid a whole text under it, the sly old devil, and unless we find the very book he used, we could count till doomsday and get nothing." He said it the way a man admits a thing he has fought hard not to admit. Honoria stood by the window with the dowager's shawl in her hands and did not move a muscle. He had got there. 4 days late. But he had got there. And then Callow said the thing that nearly undid her. He leaned back in his chair and stared up at the gallery ceiling, and he sighed, half to the room and half to some memory of his own. "There's only one man alive I'd trust to touch a running key blind," he said. "Fellow who signs himself Fen. H. Fen, never met him. Never will, I expect. He's a ghost, that one, publishes a solution now and again in the journals, the cleanest method you ever saw, and then goes silent for a year. I've written to him twice through the editors. Never a word back." He laughed, tired and rueful. "A pity. Fen would have this open by supper. The rest of us are just clever men making a noise. Fen would have this open by supper." Honoria stood in the window, with the shawl in her hands, and her father's disc in her pocket, and a letter addressed to Esquire hidden in her writing box upstairs, and she lowered her eyes to the floor. Her face did not change, her hands did not tremble. But something moved through her, in that gallery, that she would not have had a name for. To be praised so highly by the finest man in the field, and to be standing 6 feet from him unseen, it was the strangest pain she had ever carried. She was the ghost he wished he could summon. And she was minding a shawl. She turned and carried the shawl to the dowager and settled it round the old woman's shoulders, and the dowager patted her hand and never knew she had just tucked a blanket round a legend. That, you would think, was the deepest the day could cut. But the house was not done with her yet. It had one more thing to hand her. And this one, though it looked like nothing, was the hinge the whole story turns upon. The Dowager Duchess Vane was 71, and she was slowly and cheerfully giving away the past. There was to be a sale of the old Duke's effects, once the estate was settled, his books, his oddities, the accumulated clutter of an eccentric's long life, and the Dowager, who had liked Cornelius better than anyone else at Harrowmere ever had, spent her mornings sorting through boxes of his papers, deciding what to keep and what to let the auctioneers carry off. She liked Honoria's company for it, because Honoria could read the Latin on the spines, and did not hurry her. They were at it the very next morning, the two of them, in the small sitting room off the gallery, with a tea tray and a great deal of dust. The Dowager lifted things out and told their stories and set them down, and near the bottom of one box, wrapped in a bit of tissue, she found a slim little book. It was privately printed, no more than 60 pages, and its title, in plain black letters, was a glossary of the North Riding names for wildflowers. "Ah," said the Dowager, and she smiled the soft smile of an old woman remembering a friend. "Now this." This was Cornelius all over. He was mad for the old country words, you know, the names the shepherds use that you'll find in no proper book. He had this printed at his own cost, a tiny run of them, and he pressed it on everyone he wrote to. A sentimental thing. She turned it over in her spotted hands. He wrote to someone in this house for years, did you know that? Years and years. Some scholar or other, off in the world. I never learned the name. But he'd read me out bits of the letters sometimes, and they were all ciphers and flowers and heaven knows what. Happiest I ever saw him, when a letter came from that one. She held the little book out. "Here, you like this sort of thing. Take it. It'll only fetch pennies at the sale." Honoria took the book. And the moment her fingers closed on it, the whole world of that dusty morning went very quiet and very sharp. Because she knew this book, she did not know one like it. She knew this book. She owned its twin. It sat, at that very hour, on the shelf in her small cold room upstairs, where it had sat for 6 years. Cornelius Vane had sent her one long ago, folded into a letter about the very cipher method he loved best. He had pressed it on his correspondence, the Dowager had said. On everyone he wrote to. A sentimental thing, a running key is a whole text, laid letter by letter beneath a secret message. To read it you must have the one book the writer used. Any book in the world will do to hide a message, but only the right book will bring it back. And here, in an old woman's dusty hands, held out for pennies, was the book Cornelius Vane had loved best, and pressed on the one soul he trusted with his puzzles. The book he had made sure his correspondent would have. The book that would still be sitting, unremarked, in the house where he died. Honoria Fenwick sat in the thin morning light, with the twin of her own most treasured book in her hands, and she understood, all at once and completely, the thing that 4 days of the Royal Society had not so much as brushed. The wildflower glossary was the running key. The letter on the green baize, the letter that held £38,000 and the fate of the whole estate. The letter no man in 3 shires could read. She was holding the key to it. She had been holding a copy of it upstairs for 6 years without knowing what door it opened. "Miss Fenwick," said the Dowager, "you've gone quite pale. Is it the dust?" "Yes," said Honoria. Her voice was perfectly steady. It cost her everything to make it so. "The dust. Forgive me." She set the little book down in her lap, on top of the folded shawl, very gently, the way you set down something that might wake. And she looked across the dusty room, through the open door, down the length of the long gallery, to the far table where the fair copy of the ciphered letter still lay under the tall windows, guarded by nothing now but the disappointment of clever men. Downstairs, the Duke was writing to Cawood and Thrale to beg for a fortnight's grace. Out on the cold acres, Thomas Ashby was tramping between failing cottages the estate could no longer mend. And in a small dusty sitting room, a woman in grey that no one had troubled to look at sat with the key to all of it in her lap and her father's brass disc in her pocket. And did the last thing anyone at Harrowmere would have expected of the companion who fetched the port. She began, very quietly, to smile. The house went to sleep the way great houses do, one lamp at a time. Honoria lay in her narrow bed and listened to it. The settling of old timber, the wind combing the moor, somewhere below, a clock striking the half-hour, then the hour, then the half again. She did not sleep. She had not expected to. When the last servant's step had died away, she rose. She did not light a candle at once. She dressed in the dark, by touch, the way she had learned to do 100 cold mornings when a light might wake the Dowager. Grey wool, her father's brass disc in her pocket, warm now from lying against her all evening. And under her arm, wrapped in the folded shawl, the twin glossary from the Dowager's dusty room and her own copy from the shelf above her washstand. 2 little books, printed from the same worn plates. 60 pages of Yorkshire flower names apiece. She had owned one for 6 years. She had thought it a kindness from a lonely old man. It was that. It was also a key. She went down the back stair, with one candle cupped in her hand. The long gallery was a tunnel of dark. The tall windows held a little grey from the snow outside, no more. She walked its length past the portraits of Vanes, who had never troubled to look at her while they lived, and would not now. At the far end, under the middle window, the table. And on the table, where the clever men had left it in disgust, the fair copy of the ciphered letter. No one guarded it. Why would they? It was so much waste paper to every mind in the house but one. Honoria set her candle down. She drew out the chair. She sat. She had not come to win the £3,000. She wanted to be clear with herself about that. There in the cold, before she began. She had not come to shame the Duke, though God knew he had earned it. She had come because she was the one mind alive under that roof who could read the thing, and she could not bear to let it stay dark. That was all. That had always been all. With her. A locked door was an offence to her the way a lie was an offence to other people. She had spent her whole small life quietly opening them and telling no one. She laid the two glossaries side by side. She took out the disc. Now, a running key. She had known it the moment Callow read the letter aloud 4 days ago, known it the way you know a face across a crowded room. Not a simple cipher, where one letter always stood for another, and a patient man with a frequency table would grind it out in an afternoon. This was the harder, lovelier kind. Here every letter was shifted by a letter from some other text, a book, a poem, a page the two correspondents both possessed, and no one else would think to name. Find the book, and the letter opened like a flower. Fail to find it, and you might count letters till doomsday and get nothing but noise. Callow had said it himself, at the end, defeated. The key is a whole text, and no man here knows which. But she knew which. She was almost sure she knew which. She opened the glossary to its first page. The first entry. A flower the North Riding called the Granny's Nightcap, that the botany books called the Columbine. Under it, in Cornelius's fond antiquarian prose, the country law. She read off the letters of that opening line, one by one, and set the disc to the first of them, and turned it to the first letter of the ciphered block, and read what fell out the other side. A letter, then another, then a third. She did not breathe. T, H, E, a word was forming under her hands in the candlelight out of the noise that had beaten the Royal Society. She set the disc again, and again, working down the line, the little brass ring turning under her thumb with the small filed click her father had made with his own hands aboard a ship 40 years dead. The chapel, the words came up out of the dark like fish rising to a fly. Yorkshire words. Cornelius's own careful hand, speaking to her across the grave in the private tongue of two people who had never once met. She sat back. Her heart was going hard. The first block was clean. The glossary was the key. She had been holding it upstairs for 6 years, dusting it twice a year, a sentimental gift from a dead man, and it was the running key to £38,000, and she had not known. That was the first solve. She let herself feel it for the length of one breath. Then she bent again, because the letter was long, and a running key is a hungry thing. She worked down the page, and on the second block the words went to noise. She stopped. She did not panic. She had done too much of this, alone, by too many bad candles, to panic when a cipher fought back. She sat very still and thought about the man who had made it. Cornelius Vane. Linguist, eccentric, hoarder of odd printed things. A man who did nothing the plain way when a curious way lay to hand. He had not simply run the key straight down the glossary from page 1 to the end. That would have been too easy, and he had never in his life done the easy thing. He had switched. Somewhere he had jumped from one page of flowers to another, and unless she found where, the rest was mud. How would he tell his correspondent where to jump? Not in the letter, that would give the game away. In the book itself. In the key. She drew the candle closer and turned the pages of the glossary slowly, holding each one up to the light, and on the 11th leaf she found it. A faint brown ghost on the paper, the shape of a pressed flower long since fallen out. A stain where some small dried bloom had lain for years between the pages and marked them with its own slow decay. She turned on. Another 12 leaves further, another beyond that, he had marked his switch pages with pressed flowers, the way another man might dog-ear a corner. Of course he had, a wildflower glossary, keyed by wildflowers. It was exactly, maddeningly like him. She could almost hear the old man laughing. She reset her count to the first marked page and ran the second block again. Behind, the ice, house, the words fell out clean. She made a small sound in the dark, not quite a laugh. The second solve. The key text switches found by the pressed flower stains, betrayed by the very habit that made Cornelius Cornelius. She wiped her eyes with the back of her wrist. She had not known they were wet, and went on, block by block, jumping where the flowers told her to jump. And the plain text came up out of the paper hole. From the old chapel's third buttress, pace it out. Behind the ice house, a strong room the builders had faced over and plastered to look like plain wall, and inside, the tally written out in Cornelius's dry hand as though he were noting the price of coals. £38,000. Gold and consoles and the deeds. The whole liquid fortune of Harrowmere walled up in the cold ground not 200 yards from the house, while his nephew wrote begging letters to a bank, and under it the last line. The salutation that in the old fashion he had set at the foot instead of the head. She resolved it last of all, and when it came up she sat for a long time and did not move. To the one mind under this roof that would trouble to read me. She looked up. On the mantel at the gallery's end, the clock. She had come down as it struck 2. It stood now at 10 minutes short of 3. Under an hour. She had done, in under an hour, alone, by one candle, in a cold room in a borrowed dress, the thing that the most celebrated cryptographer in England had failed to do in a week, with all the Royal Society at his back. And no one in the sleeping house knew. No one would ever have to know if she chose to fold the paper and go back up to bed and let the money stay walled in the dark and the Duke go down to his bank. She thought about that, honestly, in the small hours. It would have been the safe thing, the quiet thing, the thing the Coates and Port cousin was expected to do. She made a fair copy in her own hand instead. Every line of it. She set it beside the letter, and she waited for the house to wake. They found her there in the grey of the morning, and word ran through the hall like fire in stubble. The Duke came down half-dressed, his stock untied, his face still creased from the pillow. Behind him came Callow in his dressing-gown, and behind Callow the guests who had not yet gone home from the long party, drawn by the noise the way people are always drawn, 40 of them, or near it, crowding into the long gallery in the cold clean light, the same 40 who had laughed 4 days ago while she was waved back from the table. The dowager came last, small and upright on her stick, her old eyes very bright. Honoria stood at the head of the table with her copy in her hand. "Your Grace," she said. Her voice was steady. She had made certain of that. "You offered £3,000 to any man who could read your uncle's letter. It never once occurred to you to fear a woman. It should have." She laid the fair copy on the green baize and turned it so that he could see. The Duke looked at it. She watched the sleep go out of his face and something worse come into it. He read a line and another. His colour changed. "Where did you get this?" he said. It was not a question. It was low, and it was ugly. "I read it," said Honoria. "You read it." He laughed, one short bark, and looked round at his guests for the old easy laughter, and did not quite find it. "You expect this room to believe that the companion, that you did in a night what Professor Callow of the Royal Society could not do in a week? You found it somewhere, among Cornelius's papers." Some drafted answer the old fool left lying. His voice was rising. "You copied it out, and you've the brass to stand there. A woman could not have reasoned this." "It cannot be done by reasoning at all," Callow said as much himself. "She's found it. She's cheated." There it was. She had known he would reach for it. A man like that would rather believe in a housemaid's forgery than in a spinster's mind. "I found nothing," she said. "So, you say, I can do it again." The room went still. It was Callow who broke the stillness. He had been staring at the fair copy over the Duke's shoulder, and his scholar's face had gone through several things at once. He straightened. "Your Grace." His voice was odd. There is a plain way to settle this. If she found her answer among the late Duke's papers, she cannot read a passage she has never seen. If she reasoned it, he stopped and looked at Honoria with something she had not been shown by a single soul in that house in 6 years. Attention! If she reasoned it, she can read a fresh one. Cold, before us all. "Set it, then," said the Duke. "Set it, and watch her fail." "I intend to," said Callow, though it was not clear, from his face, which failure he expected. He crossed to the table where his own defeated papers still lay. From the body of the ciphered letter he chose a block none of them had troubled with, a passage from the middle, and he copied it out fresh in his own hand so there could be no question of a prepared answer. He set it before her. And beside it, because he was, whatever else, an honest man, and had read her copy and understood in an instant what she had used, he set the little wildflower glossary. "There," he said. "The key text, since you've shown us that much. Read it, madam, aloud, step by step, so we may follow. If you can." 40 people held their breath in a cold room. Thomas Ashby had come in at the back, mud on his boots, called from the yard. She saw him find her across all the fine heads and go very still. The dowager's knuckles were white on her stick. The Duke stood with his arms folded and contempt on his mouth, waiting for the collapse. Honoria picked up her father's disc. "This block begins on the marked page," she said, quite calmly, as though she were teaching a slow but willing pupil. "You see the stain, here, where a flower was pressed. That is how he signed his switches. Professor Callow could not have known to look for it. It is not a thing in any book. It is a thing in the man." She found the line. She set the disc. The key text letter is the first of the entry for the marsh marigold. The locals call it the mollyblob, B. And the cipher letter is, she read it off the page, and so the plain letter is, she turned the little brass ring, and it clicked, her father's click, in the silence of the great room. T. She did the next without being asked. And the next. The letters came off her tongue one at a time, unhurried, and a word began to build in the cold air where no word had been, and she heard the room change around her. She did not look up. She kept her eyes on the disc and the page and let the thing speak for itself, because it always spoke better than she could. A word. Then a second, a phrase of Cornelius's dry Yorkshire, resolving out of the noise in front of witnesses, exactly as she had promised. When she had done a full line, she set the disc down and folded her hands. Nobody spoke. Callow had gone the colour of ash. He picked up the fresh passage and her spoken solution and checked it against his own knowledge of the letter, his lips moving, and she watched him find that it was right. Every letter of it. His hand was not quite steady when he set the paper down. "This is Fen's method," he said. He said it quietly, to himself, the way a man says a thing he cannot believe he is saying. The running key read blind off the source, the disc for the shift. This is precisely Fen's method. I have read it a dozen times and never once. He stopped. He lifted his head and looked at her, truly looked, as though the plain grey woman in front of him were resolving too, out of noise into sense, under his eyes. "I have spent 4 days wishing to God that Fen were in the room." "Professor," said Honoria. She reached into her pocket. She had carried it there 4 days, warm against the brass. The letter the post had brought at the start of the week, that she had taken from the hall table before any curious eye could read the direction. She laid it on the green baize beside her copy, face up, so the address showed to the room. To H. Fen-esque, care of Harrowmere Hall. "Fen is in the room," she said. "Fen has fetched your port all week." Callow looked at the letter. He looked at her. His mouth opened and shut. "You," he said. "You are Fen." "I am Honoria Fenwick," she said. "I publish as Fen because no journal in England will print a paper on ciphers over a woman's name. You have cited me, Professor. You cited me in your monograph of 69 on the 3rd page. I was very proud. A small, dry beat. I could not tell anyone why." The room made a sound then, a low collective sound, the sound of 40 settled certainties coming loose at once. And into it the dowager spoke, from her place by the door, in her thin old voice that carried the way old voices do. Cornelius's correspondent, her hand had gone to her mouth. All those years, he'd shut himself in the library and write half the night and never say to whom, and when I asked he'd only smile and say. He said the finest mind in England answered his letters, and he'd not spoil it by telling. It was you. It was you the whole time, sitting at my elbow mending my lace. Her eyes were wet. Child, he trusted no one on this earth but you. And that was the second thing, laid open before them all. Not only was the ghost scholar the Royal Society revered the companion below the salt, the vanished Duke, who had hidden a fortune from his own blood and left it locked in a cipher, had trusted the reading of it to one person living, and she had been under his roof, unpaid, uncounted, the whole time. Honoria stood in the middle of it and made herself look at them, at each of them. It was the only revenge she would allow herself, and she took it slowly. She looked at the stout gentleman who had handed her his wet greatcoat in the hall on the first night, without so much as turning his head, and who now could not lift his eyes from the floor, and who had gone a deep, unhappy red from his collar to his scalp. She looked at the young man who had called out, 4 nights ago, when the Duke held up her father's disc, the companion's toy, and got his laugh for it. He was not laughing, he was studying his own hands as though he had never seen them before, and he did not once look at the brass disc lying on the baize, could not make himself look at it. She looked at the 2 fine women who had talked across her at dinner for a week as though her chair were empty, discussing her within her hearing as one discusses a piece of furniture that has come with the house. They had nothing to say now. One of them had put up her fan, though the room was cold, and she looked, last, at the Duke. Aldous Vane had not moved. But everything had gone out of his face, the sleep, the contempt, the ready cruelty, and left it slack and grey. A man watching a floor he had thought was stone turn out to be ice, and hear it crack. He had staked £3,000 and his pride before the whole county on there being no such mind in 3 shires, and certainly no such woman. And the woman had been carrying his coats. "It isn't proven," he said, "but it came out weak, a man saying a thing he no longer believed himself. A copied answer is one thing. This theatre proves, then let the ground prove it," said Honoria. She had not raised her voice once. She did not raise it now. The letter says there is a strong room behind the ice house, faced over to look like a plain wall, reached from the 3rd buttress of the old chapel. It says there is £38,000 in it, in gold and consols, and the deeds to the home farm. "I did not put it there, Your Grace. Your uncle did, 12 years ago, and told no one but a woman he had never met. Send men to the wall. If I have lied, you will find nothing, and you may turn me out of doors this morning with the county's blessing." She paused. "If I have not lied, you will find your fortune where a spinster's reasoning said it would be. Shall we go and see?" For a moment, nobody moved. Then Thomas Ashby pushed forward from the back of the room, mud and all, and said the first plain sensible words anyone had spoken since the Duke came down. "I've the men and the tools in the yard this minute," he said. "It's an hour's work to open a faced wall. Your Grace, with respect, you'll not settle this standing here, calling the lady a liar. You'll settle it at the ice house." He looked at Honoria, and there was nothing in his face but a steady old belief that predated all of this, that had been there since he first lent her a journal under his own name and asked her nothing in return. "I'd stake my place on it," he said. I've read her mind at work before now. There's no cheat in it. Never was. The whole party went out into the wet morning to watch a wall come down. It was a strange procession, and Honoria walking near the head of it in her grey wool was the strangest part, though she went quite composedly, with the dowager's hand tucked into her arm. The dowager had insisted, and leaned on her the whole way, and said not one word, only held her tight. Behind them the guests came in their furs and their thin morning shoes, ruining them in the slush, none willing to be the one who missed it. The Duke came apart from the rest, alone, his face shut. Ashby's men were already at the wall behind the ice-house when they came round the yew hedge. Honoria stopped them. "Not there," she said. There she counted along the old chapel foundation with her eye, buttress to buttress. 1, 2, 3, and paced it out into the sodden grass exactly as the plain text gave it, 40 of the county's best watching a companion measure the ground with her own 2 feet. Here, this is the plaster face. Cut here. The pick went in. The men worked fast, the way men work when a whole crowd is holding its breath at their backs. The plaster came away in wet sheets, and behind it, not stone, brick, new brick, in a wall that pretended to be old. A made thing. A hidden thing. Somebody in the crowd said, "Oh, involuntary," and was hushed. They took out the brick. Behind it was a low iron door, red with rust, the kind that closes a strong room, set into the cold ground where there was no earthly reason for a door to be, unless a man had wanted something never found. Ashby's keyman worked at the old lock, and the crowd pressed in, and the Duke came forward at last despite himself, drawn like all the rest. The door groaned open on the dark. Ashby went in with a lantern. There was a silence in which Honoria could hear the snow melt dripping off the yew and her own heart and nothing else. Then Ashby's voice came out of the ground, and it was not quite steady. "It's here," he said. "God above, it's all here." They brought it out into the grey daylight, box by box in front of everyone. The gold in canvas sacks that took 2 men each, the consols in their japanned tin, dry as the day they were sealed, the deeds in oilskin. And Honoria stood with her fair copy in her cold hand, and read the tally off it aloud as each thing came up, and Callow checked it, item by item, and it matched. To the pound, it matched. £38,000 walled in the winter ground, that a woman had found in an hour with a book of flowers and her father's toy, tallied now against her own writing in front of the same 40 people who had watched her handed the coats. Reality had given its verdict. There was no arguing with a wall of gold. The Duke stood and looked at it, at the salvation of his house lying in the mud, and could not speak. Every debt to Cawood and Thrale, the 12,000 due at Michaelmas with 31 days to run, it was covered 3 times over and more. Harrowmere was saved. And it had been saved by the one person he had waved away from the table with an order to fetch the port. They went back into the gallery to end it, because a thing like that must be ended in the place it began. The Duke had got some of his composure back on the cold walk in, but it was a poor brittle thing now, and everyone could see the crack in it. He stood by the green baize table, where 4 mornings ago he had thrown the letter down and made his boast. Honoria stood across from him, where she had been waved back from standing. The room arranged itself around them and waited. "You made an offer, Your Grace," she said, "before these witnesses. £3,000 to any man who could read the letter. I am not a man, a dry beat, but I read the letter. I think the county would be interested to see whether a Duke of Harrowmere keeps his word to the letter, or only to the spirit that suits him." His jaw worked. He looked round the room once, and found in it not one friendly face, for they had all watched the gold come up, and there is no crowd on earth so cold as the crowd that has just been made to feel a fool for its own contempt. There was no way out. He had staked it in public and lost it in public, and now he must pay in public, or be a man who cheated a woman of a wager after she had handed him a fortune. Even his pride could not carry that. He sent for the strong-box. He counted it out himself. She made him do it himself, simply by standing there and waiting, though she never said the words, £3,000. On to the green baize, note by note, in front of the whole county, his face like a man swallowing gravel. When it was done, he stood back from it as from something that had burned him. Honoria did not snatch it up. She let it lie a moment. Then she gathered it, unhurried, and she did with it the one thing that finished him. "I'll keep enough to be my own woman," she said. "A small settlement. A roof I answer to no one for. I have earned that, I think, over rather a long time." She set a portion aside. Then she pushed the rest, the greater part, a good £2,000 and more, back across the bays toward him. "The remainder is for the cottages on the north edge, the ones your uncle let fail, and you have let fail since. The Ackroyd family had ice on the inside of their walls this week. Mr. Ashby will tell you he's been begging you for the roof money all winter. Mend them. That is not a request, Your Grace, for I have no standing to request anything of you." She looked at him levelly. "It is only what I choose to do with what is mine. I ask you for nothing. I never will again." And that was the sharpest thing she could have done, and she knew it, and so did he. She shamed him not by taking, but by giving, by asking him for nothing at all, before all his guests, so that the smallness was all his and none of it hers. The sneer that had lived on that man's mouth since the day she came did not come back. It never did come back, not once in all the years she knew him after. It was Callow who spoke into the quiet, and he spoke to the whole room, deliberately, so it would be heard and carried. "Miss Fenwick." He bowed to her, a full bow, the bow of the Royal Society to a peer. "I have cited Fen for 11 years. It has been the honour of my professional life without my knowing it. If you will permit me, I should like to sponsor your election under your own name, madam, your own name and no other, and read your method before the Society myself, and let any man who doubts it come and be corrected, as I have been corrected this morning." He straightened. It is long past time England knew whose mind it has been quoting. She inclined her head. She did not trust herself just then to speak. It was the door she had spent 38 years assuming would never open to her, had assumed so completely that she had stopped, long ago, even knocking. And a stranger she had bested had opened it and stood aside and asked her to walk through. 6 months on. There is a small stone cottage on the Harrowmere Road, low and snug, with a good chimney and a garden gone over to whatever chooses to grow. The morning light comes in at the east window and lies across a broad desk, and the desk is covered, happily permanently covered, in open dictionaries. 4 languages this week. A grammar of Basque that has defeated better men. A monograph, half finished, in a firm clear hand. Honoria Fenwick sat at the desk in the good light and read over what she had written, and at the foot of it, where for 11 years she had put a lie because the world required one, she signed her own name. Honoria Fenwick, the whole of it. It looked strange to her still, her own name at the foot of her own work. Strange and very good, like a coat that fits after a lifetime of borrowed ones. On the window-sill, where the morning sun struck it and set it glowing, stood her father's brass disc. Mounted now on a little stand a York clockmaker had made for it, out of the pocket where it had lived so long and into the light. A toy, the young man had called it, that first cold night. A toy her naval father had filed by hand for a daughter he hoped would use her mind. It had opened a strong room and a life. It caught the sun and threw a small bright coin of it onto the wall, and she liked to watch that of a morning while she thought. She heard him on the lane before she saw him. Thomas Ashby come up from the hall with the post under his arm and a borrowed journal to return, the way he had returned a borrowed journal on that other, colder morning, before any of it. He came most mornings now. He never made much of it, and neither did she, and that suited them both. He valued her mind. He had valued it when it was a secret and a scandal and worth nothing to anyone. He had lent her books under his own name and asked her for nothing, and never once known there was a fortune anywhere near it. That was the whole of it, and it was enough, and more than she had ever thought to have. She went to the door to meet him. Down the road, a carriage passed, the Duke's, going to the county sessions, for Harrowmere was solvent now, and its master respectable and dull. He saw her at her cottage door. He raised his hat. She inclined her head. That was all there was between them now, and all there would ever be, a civil, careful nothing from a man who had learned, expensively and in front of everyone, that the only key in a house full of clever men had been the woman he told to fetch the port. Ashby handed her the post. There was a letter from Callow on top, and the Society's seal on it, and she would open that later, slowly, in the sun. He handed her the journal too. "There's a passage in it," he said, "I couldn't make head nor tail of." "Thought you might." "Leave it," she said, and smiled. "I'll read it after breakfast." The old Duke had set his salutation at the foot of the letter, in the old way, and she had resolved it last of all, alone, at 3 in the morning by a single candle. "To the one mind under this roof that would trouble to read me." He had meant it for her, all along. Across all the years and the silence and the grave, he had known that when the day came, of all the clever men in England, the one who would trouble to read him would be the woman nobody thought to test. She had troubled. And so the door had opened. If this story reached you, comment the town you're watching from. I should like to see how far it travels.